So I created this activity sequence to meet the pronunciation needs of a group of young learners aged 12 to 13. The average proficiency in the class is A2 to B1 level. As native Mandarin speakers, the students struggle to distinguish between different vowel sounds. I think this is probably because in Chinese there are only 5 distinct vowel sounds, whereas according to Ohata there are over 15 distinct vowel sounds in English, and also Chinese doesn't have any minimal pairs. Although these vowel sounds don't feature as part of Jenkins' lingua franca core, and people like Brown argue they shouldn't be pronunciation priorities because context usually helps the listener understand what the speaker is trying to say, I would suggest that this is true for native speakers, but for low-level learners like this class, they simply don't have the language to be able to make accurate guesses. As Field says, many of the matches they make are only rough approximations, and so their inability to recognise these different phonemes actually not only restricts their communication but also impedes their listening ability. For my learners, they've made a number of unfortunate mistakes with these particular sounds over the last few weeks. For example, I went to the beach, they say I went to the bitch. I need a sheet becomes I need a shit. And blued for blood, which took a long time to understand what they were trying to say. And it also sounds like often they don't understand singular and plurals because they say things like this books instead of these books. One reason Mandarin speakers seem to find it difficult to distinguish between long and short vowels is because they don't change their position of articulation. So they use the R sound for mama for the R, A, and the sound in English, and they just shorten or lengthen the sound. Whereas in English speakers, actually, we change the position of our tongue to make these different vowel sounds. Also, Underhill suggests that because consonant sounds are formed by the contact of two surfaces, like the lips, it's easier for learners to see these, whereas for vowel sounds, it's about the shape of the mouth and the position of the tongue, which can be harder for them to see. So I think this is a useful activity sequence for my learners. So to raise awareness of these sounds, I first asked them to listen and circle the odd one out, and then drew out the phonemes that we were looking at, the E, I, and A sound, and wrote them on the board with an example, which then allowed us to move on to the second activity where I read the sounds and asked them in teams to hold up the right card. They found the odd one out activity quite easy because they had 3 other examples. This was more challenging for them, but also helped to raise their awareness of how they're written phonetically, which helped them later in the class. We then moved from this to a bingo grid, where I used a number of different minimal pairs to help them to distinguish not only the sound, but how the sound was different to other phonemes. And then finally onto a bingo grid with the sounds written phonetically with the phonemes, and they could use the board as reference, and I asked them to write example words for each one as they heard them, which was a really effective way of raising their awareness. Once they were able to hear the different sounds, we then moved on to production, and guided by Underhill's physicality of sounds, I mimed the sound to them. For example, asked them to say the sound, then hear the sound as I said it in their head and repeat it. And we also looked at the difference between sounds and how the sounds relate to one another, the E to the E, and the difference in their mouth from the E to the and how the mouth shape is different where their tongue is, which gave them tools for later in the class. After this, I gave them practice of saying the sounds as individual words. For example, they read the words in the bingo grid and their partner held up the different cards, which worked well, but I found that I needed to actually make some extra cards. For example, the sound, which was in the bingo grid, we'd covered it before, but I didn't have a card for it. After this, they moved on to Hancock's pronunciation journey using the minimal pairs I gave them. And this worked well because it was practicing both their receptive and their productive skills, and there was also some lively debate when some of them thought their partner had pronounced the word incorrectly. The last activity we did looking at the words was I adapted Hancock's dominoes and made our own domino set. And they had some wild cards where they could write in a word, as well as the sounds that we've been focusing on, for example the R sound. So I replaced the O and the OW sound with the wild cards and the R sound, because the O and the OW are quite difficult for my learners and we haven't covered those sounds explicitly yet. And the idea was they had to, in teams, make the longest thread, the longest domino line that they could, and they really enjoyed this activity, and it gave them more pronunciation practice and also highlighted some errors like blued still, which we could look at. Finally, they moved on to some freer practice using Hancock sound pictures, where they described them to their partner, and I recorded them so I could hear their errors. I found this activity sequence was effective in raising students' awareness and giving them tools, for example, of physicality, where the tongue is, where the shape of the mouth. So when they got to connected speech, if they made errors, I could remind them of these and mime the sound to them so they could self-correct. So I think this was a useful sequence for my learners.